Just in case people who couldn't make it today are interested, it's another way of sharing. So thank you for that. Okay, so we have Ganesh in the other room. Yes, I might just start because we've only got an hour, so we haven't got very long. I'm not planning to talk for very long. I mainly want to hear from you guys once you can see what it is that I'm talking about. So thank you all for your interest in this, and I thought I'd tell you a little bit about why I'm interested in it. So I have previously done some work on carbon accounting internationally, and when I came and started working here, looking at carbon accounting, I saw that land use wasn't included in it, and I was quite alarmed by that because I think previously it could have been maybe up to 80% of the emissions when we included it. So that's possibly going to change soon. And what we didn't know, so we had looked at what difference it made internationally, but we didn't have examples of that for Australia. So I applied for a bit of funding to have a look at what difference that could make to Australian livestock management systems. And so the idea with this is it's seed funding, and it's an opportunity to apply for a larger grant to do whatever we want with it. So this is kind of an invitation to you if you're interested in becoming involved in this in some way. Maybe we can do some accounts for people's properties. Maybe we can look at different sectors. There are all sorts of options of what we could do with this. And Ganesh Bhattarai, who's also working on this, and is on the call here, he's going to write a proposal for future funding to take this forward. So that's partly about getting your input into what we might be able to do with this for future funding. And so he's going to be taking note of anything that you say that we can include both in the report for this and in future proposals. So I had originally planned to come and meet with you individually and invite people from your local area to come and join us. But unfortunately, with the way the project has been administered this year, all the funding had to be spent last year. So the only options I have for this meetings are Zoom, or I can cycle to places in Launceston if you're in Launceston. But and in some ways Zoom's more convenient for everybody these days anyway, so it's less travel time and so on. But I am quite happy to hold future meetings if anybody's interested in talking to me about this individually, or coming to visit you if you're local. Okay, so that's my interest. I'm also working on the meat and livestock goal to go carbon neutral. So the project to do the carbon storage component of that is being run for Australia nationally from Launceston by Matt Harrison. So that's another part of my interest in this, and some of this is informed by that. So we do have a project in Tasmania, a case study farm in Tasmania near Campbelltown for that. I might just share my screen. Screen. Okay, so can you see my PowerPoint presentation now? Is that... You can probably also see this, can't you? How's that? Does that work? Good. Okay. Okay, so there's our contact details. And I'll bring that back up at the end if anybody wants to contact either me or Ganesh about this. Ganesh is also looking, so I've been mainly looking at livestock. Ganesh is looking across different sectors, but so far he's looked at horticulture, so he can talk about that potentially, if anybody's interested. I was going to ask you to introduce yourselves, but I thought it was only going to be about half a dozen of us. I think maybe if you could just put into the chat what it is that's your interest in livestock accounting, that would be very useful as well. Okay, so things work. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do in this session, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about why would we think about land use in carbon accounting. And then I've got the, I've done a little bit of modeling of this for this project of different livestock systems and what they look like with the way that carbon accounting works now and how it might work with the change of including land use. Then I'm going to think a little bit about greenhouse gas mitigation. So what are the implications for landholders and the different ways that they currently manage their land and how they might be able to mitigate? So with all of this, I'm hoping, I did say this was a webinar, but it's not really, it's just a meeting. So any of you can talk at any time, and I'm quite happy to discuss anything at any time as we go through, but like we've only got an hour. So what I've got to say only takes about 15 minutes. So yeah, and then we can have a bit of a general discussion about what do you think about it, how fair it is, what are better ways of doing this, or anything else that you want to talk about. Okay, so why do we do land use? Why are we talking about land use and carbon accounting? So what currently happens is that the way the IPCC set this up is that there are different kind of sectors that they account for land for greenhouse gas emissions, so energy and transport and agriculture. But there's this other land use change and forestry sector, which isn't an industry sector. Well, the forestry part is, but the land use and land use change is really done by the other sectors. But because it's a separate sector, the only part that they ever really account for of that is land use change if it happened in the year that they're talking about. So one of the things that's happened is that it's also been annualized. So they look at what are the emissions for a year, and so they only consider emissions for that year if the land use change happened in that year. So if the land has previously been cleared, then that's a kind of historic change, and it's just kind of water under the bridge and it's never accounted for. But what's happened is people have realized that this is a problem. And the change is coming. So what's happened is that the federal government has a plan for how to include land use, and the greenhouse, that's the submissions for that have just closed, and the greenhouse gas protocol has new guidelines coming out that will be coming out this year, and they were doing consultation all last year for how that should happen. So I've previously published a paper looking at this, and I can share those results if anybody's interested, but that, I could say that wasn't Australia, that was international work. So why we might want to include land use is that the reason why we do any of this is to reduce the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we think that about a third of the excess gases could be stored in vegetation. And that's just with the available land now. But if the land was used more efficiently, so 70% of the land that's used is used by livestock, and they use, on average, the livestock use land at about 6 to 7 times the amount that's needed to produce the product that they produce. So yeah, you can get away with about 15% of the land area on average for producing livestock. Now, you might not want to go as efficient as that. That's a bit extreme, but you can see that maybe there's the potential to solve the problem of climate change just in the land use sector, if we did everything optimally, although that's a big ask. But anyway, one of the things the ideas with this is to get the mechanisms that are in place to address greenhouse gases, to encourage land use efficiency so that carbon can be stored on as much of the land as possible. And one of the advantages of that is it means that it doesn't have to be farmers' jobs to do it, because all they need to do is use their land efficiently, which is probably a good thing for production anyway. And then other sectors can be responsible for the storage if farmers don't want to do it, or they can have a second business of being a carbon farmer. So it brings choices in there. Okay, so these are the sectors that I've looked at for this project. So there's grazing, which is the sort of thing we typically see in Tasmania, where most of the vegetation has been converted to pasture, and it's quite extensive land use. There's feedlotting. I think it's only a couple in Tasmania, but they store the livestock very intensively, but the feed is grown elsewhere. So there's two lots of land use that are required for that system. There's fodder cropping, which is also quite common in Tasmania. So you have pasture, but you also grow some crops and lucerne or something like that. In Europe, they tend to grow more intensive crops like root vegetables for livestock. And this system, you know, it's a bit more efficient than just pasture, but it's only part of the year. You can't just feed lucerne all year round. This one at the top right, I don't know, can you see my mouse? Yep. Yes. So that's an intensive silvopastoral system. So that's mainly in the tropics and the subtropics. But the idea with that is that fodder is grown extremely intensively in the understory of the forest. So these are Lucina plants. They're grown at about 10,000 plants per hectare. So it's an intensive system, although it stores carbon in the landscape as well. So we think that that is potentially the most efficient system and probably quite good for welfare and so on as well. I'm not sure how you can do it outside of the climate zones that it currently operates in, like could we have wattles or something like that in a temperate system to achieve the same sort of production intensity. Obviously, we've got less light and warmth and so on in temperate zones. And then most of Australia is this system, which is rangeland systems where livestock are just grazed on the natural vegetation. So it's not really, doesn't tend to typically be really cleared. If it does, that causes problems. But so it stores the carbon. Most of the carbon that was there is still there, but they use vast areas. So it has big impact through the area, but not through reduced carbon storage per hectare. Okay, so this is what I've done with looking at how these systems are different for the black columns are current carbon accounting and the green columns are if you include land use. So how land use is included, it's the carbon that's stored in your landscape now compared to what could be stored in the landscape. So if you look at the black columns, you know, feedlots are a bit better than grazing, and silvopasture is probably a bit better than feedlotting. Fodder cropping's probably a bit similar to grazing, maybe a little bit better. And rangelands, so if you look at the map of rangelands, they vary hugely, and that's why you get a big difference. So the black columns are all the same for rangeland because that was from a review, quite a good source that was there wasn't a huge difference anyway. So that's one of the things is methane emissions don't change that much. It's the land use that makes a really big difference depending on what you do. So and that's why if there's not much difference, then the results don't change much. But if you remove a lot of the carbon from your landscape and you use a big area, then there's a big difference between the two ways of doing accounting. Okay, so if we think about the individual systems and why they might have these results, so extensive grazing uses a lot of land and it has removed a lot of the carbon. I'm not sure it's always like this. Like some people seem to manage, depending on soils, you've got to still store quite a lot of carbon. So that's an interesting question. That's something we could look at. Is it possible with this sort of system to be carbon neutral for carbon storage? But the feed quality is typically quite low. So methane emissions are a bit higher as well. with feedlots, your land usage is quite small, but virtually all of the carbon is removed. And actually, I couldn't get good figures for that. So these results will probably be even a bit worse than what it looks like here. Unfortunately, their methane emissions aren't a lot better, not as much as you might think, because they still feed them chaff and things like that. So if they wanted to reduce their emissions, they could probably more easily in this by feeding better quality feed and by producing their crops more intensively, using less area to produce their crops. I think this could then improve.
Rowan, just a comment on that.
Yeah.
They're generally only feedlotted for between 3 to 6 months. Some are going beyond that, but they've been raised in extensive systems before that.
That's right. So this is the effect of those 3 months of the year, because it's Australian systems. Internationally, so if you look at Britain, for instance, nearly all of their beef is produced from dairy. And a lot of their dairy is very intensive systems. So yes, I agree in Australia. And these figures are for that just feedlot finishing, not for the entire life spent in a feedlot. So it's the difference that it makes to get them to wait sooner. So you've got less days of methane emissions. That's the main, probably the main way that feedlots help. Because it's what the measure you're wanting to look for is the emissions intensity, live weight gain per unit of product, because that's your impact really. Because if you just get your total emissions down, you can do that by not producing anything. That's not useful, because that production just goes somewhere else where it continues emitting. So really, it's emissions intensity that's the important figure. And,
that's what. Sorry, that was just because that's what we've done with the goats. So coming through our dairy system. So we've gone into hybrid offspring. Sorry about my voice, everyone. I'm just getting over a lurgy. But that's we've reduced the numbers on farm by almost total numbers by about 50% simply by going into hybrids and having them on farm for 4 months less.
Do you still get the same production?
Yeah.
Yeah,
we've tweaked a couple of things here and there, but we've grossly reduced our emissions by turning animals off in better condition but sooner. So
and it was actually you I was thinking of that might be possible to actually store as much carbon in the landscape, even with these extensive systems. So yeah, you're potentially a really interesting example from that. Yes, so and similarly with the fodder cropping, well, with the systems I've typically seen in Tasmania, if you're growing lucerne, it's only a certain time of the year. I don't know if that's the case for generally, but yeah, so that's why it only makes a little. Well, it's one of the reasons it only makes a little bit of difference, is because it's only for maybe a quarter of the year or something like that you're getting the extra feed, and it's only a little bit more productive. So it's partly about the yield. So yield is a good measure, because the tons per hectare that you get if you're including the land use. So one thing I would say, Ian, about that and the measures is that the tons of methane per unit of product is a good measure, so long as you include the land use as well. It's otherwise it's leaving out a big chunk. Oh, and Dominique's let's say something.
Yeah, just Rowan, I need clarification about how you're accounting for the feedlot cattle prior to them entering the feedlot. Is that considered in this profile that you've generated, or is that attributed to the past system?
So I'm using numbers generally from the literature for this. I've done a little bit of modeling. Mainly I did the modeling for the land use part, but otherwise I used numbers from the literature. So I think this might have been Richard Eckhart's, or anyway, it's basically probably the top left system prior to going into the feedlot. So it's probably this plus then this for the last 4 months or something.
Alrighty. Yeah, so it's taking into consideration the entire lifespan of the animal.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not just the component. Actually, it would be interesting to do a system that was entirely like the British. you know about allocation, and they've got, if you've got dairy and beef, then which you allocate to the two systems. So we did that with looking at the British dairy system, but because we were only accounting for dairy in Britain, we didn't account for the beef. So I don't know the answer actually for the beef in the British system. The beef that we looked at was in Latin America, where they use a lot more of these sorts of systems. So yeah, the silver pasture, basically you've got the carbon, you've got high quality intensive feed in all the same landscape at the same time. And when we looked at the land use, it seemed to be even more land use efficient than feedlotting for Latin America, but we haven't got these systems in the same way here. Yes, Ganesh.
Ron, I don't know if you are able to look into the chat, but Graham Henn has shared his, I think, research information that they are going to soon publish. If Graham can come and share that, I think it's similar to what we are doing.
Oh, great. I can put the chat in the other window so it doesn't have to interview your view. So I forgot my mouse. It's work.
Sorry, still getting settled. Just coming from shifting the cow. There you go, Rowan. Yeah, so just this is in Victoria, 300 mil rainfall.
Yeah, very low.
They changed their management on 20% of the farm, and they've sequestered. They've just had the audit by DPI Vic or whatever they're called now, DEPJA. So it's all coming through the ERF through one of the programs. So, but they're capturing more carbon than they're emitting on the whole farm.
Wow, great.
5 years worth. So there is big things to come.
Yeah,
I'm not a big fan of the whole efficiency thing, because with feedlot you actually increase the total CO2 emissions generally, and a lot of the MLA thinking on sort of the northern areas and irrigating and things like that, actually Australia as a whole will emit more CO2, even though you're lowering the CO2 equivalents per kilogram of beef. So there's a lot of flaws still going around, and I've been trying to work with Richard Eckard a lot and stuff. So so we're sort of just on the point of making a lot of these things a big change. And I've worked in Brazil as well. So.
Oh, yeah, so you've been seeing those sorts of systems. So I think one of the things is, if you don't really want to have a net lot of production, because if that production is moving off your farm, then you need to account for what happens to it when it goes somewhere else. I mean, that's the whole leakage problem. So I think that's with MLA, that's their approach is, okay, we're just going to say we want all our scenarios to not have any net loss of production. And that's how you get around the having to account for. When we did this work internationally, we accounted for wherever it went. Now that gets a bit complicated. There's a lot of assumptions involved in that. But so I think, the important thing is to account for all of this properly and not leave out big chunks. So yes, and one way to do it is through efficient land use, and maybe you can do it other ways as well. Okay, so I think that's all of those systems. Is there anyone else? Oh, Ian, sorry. You were muted.
Right. The goats never listen to me anyway. Just a quick question, with land use change you're talking about, is it from a fixed point in time, or is it, in terms of a state of flux? So land clearing that was done 100 years ago, is that then accounted for, or is it from a fixed point going forward? So if you change your land going forwards, this is what it's going to be, or is this accounting for that change, which has actually sort of had a compounding effect over time?
Yes, so this is the important question. So that's the difference between land use and land use change. So, in the IPCC, they say land use change, and the forestry. And then everyone through some sort of magic just goes land use change and leaves out land use. So, the idea is that if a cow occupies a hectare or 100 hectares in something like SBGAF, there is no difference. Like SBGAF doesn't ask how much land you use. So it's kind of like the carbon opportunity cost. So obviously, if you change in that year, that's already should really be accounted for in the sorts of methods we use now. But so how it counts for it is how much land you're using, how much carbon you store in it, and how much carbon could potentially be stored in that land. So that's the idea. And there's different arguments about it. I've been arguing that to be correct, it should really be how much carbon could you store in that land with your production on it, so that you don't get that leakage problem. I think that it's been regarded as being a little bit complicated to say what that is. So as you can see in your case, you might be able to get exceptional results, but not everyone can achieve that, what you've achieved. So so from simplicity point of view, it sounds like they're probably, and we'll have to see when the guidelines come out what they actually go with, but it sounded like they were tending to go with what could be the vegetation could hold. And some people have the potential to go carbon positive, and it might be that you are doing that, Ian. I think the system that Ganesh is looking for, so Ganesh is looking at horticultural systems. It sounds like he can talk about that as well a bit, if anybody's interested in horticulture. So if you think about it, horticulture, they plant a lot of kind of quite substantial trees, quite often tree crops. He's looking at macadamias. You know, maybe that stores more carbon than what was there before. So and maybe, you know, if you really try and store carbon in your soil, you can store more carbon in your soil than was there before. I don't know. So yeah, these are the sorts of questions. But the problem is we're trying to solve a problem of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We want the system to be trying to work to do that, and not be having. So the problem with having a baseline year, this is something that Australia really argued for, because their rate of land clearing had reduced. So they knew they could meet their Kyoto targets without having to do anything by having that baseline year. It doesn't achieve what happens is you get perverse incentives to clear them. Yeah, because you want to go from a low baseline to a higher baseline. So before you do your baselining, you want to get the carbon as low as possible. And then they try and bring in rules to prevent that, and it's not always very successful. So, hi, Dom. Yes.
Oh, sorry, it just dropped out there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. I just think it's a really important distinction to make when you're looking at this carbon opportunity cost, about whether you're talking about storage or flux and how that impacts on your net account. Because if you're getting to a point over time with storage in forests and soils where you're meeting or reaching like an equilibrium,
exactly,
then
what do you do after 20 years?
Yeah, that impact your net accounts. Yeah, so I'm a little bit confused about what's going into your land use.
Yeah, it's just storage.
Measures, really.
It's just storage. So the change is
storage over time, like accumulation of storage, or
it's just what's stored in it at any point in time. So it's not a per year. It's just a mass per area. It's not a per year. You don't have a year in there in the metric. Actually, Ganesh, you might want to say something about your system here, because I think it's an interesting. It raises that issue that Dom just talked about what happens at the end of the when the at climax compared to natural.
Yeah, so sure, Ron. So I'm looking into, like, how macadamia plants are grown in terms of emissions in the Queensland region, and I used a few models to look into the potential of native vegetation sequestration in Queensland, and also looked into literature and how much carbon do macadamia actually hold in those farms. So looking into a 25 years time frame, we have a very higher range of data. So for native vegetation, we found from some model it can hold up to 110 ton of carbon in throughout like 25 years period. But there was also some model that suggests only 35 ton carbon could be hold. And if we are looking into macadamia, then the range is between 75 ton to 100 tons of carbon. But the difference I see here, there are few things that need to be considered. Like when you say macadamia, then the biodiversity aspect, if you look, there is very less biodiversity, whereas native vegetation, there is quite rich biodiversity. But at the end of like 20 or 25 years, you can, usually macadamia production are very productive until 30 years time. So 25, 30 years, you can take out the macadamia plants and use that to make biochar, furniture, or conserve that carbon. Whereas for native vegetation now, you can't take it out after that period. So they are more on equilibrium, but you don't have that potential to generate more carbon. So this is my initial finding, but there are many things that still need to be considered, like the economics and the biodiversity aspects.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ron.
You obviously you're going to reach a climax with natural vegetation, but potentially through production systems you can keep removing the carbon over time. So I think that would be one interesting thing to look at, is potentially over the very long term. How does that keep going? And what I was going to say, Ian, with what you were saying is that I don't know if you know, there's another farm, well-known farm, which I won't mention the name of, you probably already know, that's been claiming it's carbon neutral for a long time, and they've saturated their carbon stores and they're not carbon neutral anymore. So yeah, that's and that will probably eventually happen to you as well, I expect. It happens with soil carbon. Yeah.
It's a really interesting point, because that's only if you don't keep growing topsoil. If you keep growing topsoil and you should be able to keep adding to it. If you've got the organic matter there and you can keep building organic matter, then you will keep storing carbon. Because you are changing that, as you were saying before, where you're going on that ecological progression, you'll end up going to a different place. So if you're looking at a fixed system, absolutely you'll top out quite easily. But if it's a living system, you will keep going.
Yeah, so it's interesting to what extent that's achievable in production systems, because and hi Irina, sorry, I did see your hand before, I forgot.
Hi, can you hear me now? I had a bit of a problem.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I think there were several interesting issues also raised here. And hello to everybody, by the way. I came from Finland, from European context, and I worked with somewhat similar issues, though not specifically on carbon. But some of the issues that were picked up are other impacts, because just looking at carbon also may create some other problems. One of them are nutrients. For example, carbon accumulation is dependent on nitrogen and phosphorus availability, and phosphorus is mined elsewhere and has its also externalities. So in some of the projects that we were running on such pastoral systems, we were also looking at eutrophication potential, water scarcity, because in some contexts that's the water availability that is critical. And then we had also separately fossil resource scarcity. So you have the warming potential, but you look specifically on fossil energy use out of that, which is a very important issue. And of course, biodiversity. In some system, at least in Europe, when these pastoral systems have been co-evolving for thousands of years, there's certain biodiversity values there that one doesn't want necessarily also to throw out. So these are very difficult and trade-offs, and often come with productivity.
Yeah, so many of those greenhouse gas factors that you mentioned should be included in this if it's done properly. The phosphorus one as well, there's the whole limit to the total supply of phosphorus, which is a huge ethical issue for humanity, I think. And, we want to do things like, let's develop the north, where we probably use up all our remaining phosphorus in one go if we really try to do that, and we're going to have big problems with that. But yeah, so if you're interested in local biodiversity, then obviously the biodiversity issue is a separate thing that needs to be accounted for. But in general, if you look at the system as a whole, as in the planet as a whole, then using land more efficiently generally tends to result in higher biodiversity, because there's more biodiversity in large intact areas than there can ever be in farmland, where you're really generally sharing it with fairly common species. So most of the species that are at risk are in natural areas, but that's not true for everywhere. For places that have been occupied for very long periods, it may be that the only nature that's left is things that can survive in farmland. So places like Britain, you get, you know, if you're interested in the local effect in the local area, you get a different answer than if you're interested in the effect on the system as a whole. Okay. We're going to talk about this anyway on Monday, so we can go into more detail with this.
That's true.
And other things, what's going on in Europe. Okay, so rangelands, we did look at this a bit. So we've got this vast, most of the examples I could find had a similar-ish sort of result, and it's not that different from what their measurement is now. So the thing is that at the moment, rangelands look relatively bad compared to other systems, but not once you include the land use, unless you're doing something really extraordinary, like using vast areas and clearing it. Then it's worse. But somebody who looked at this with me the other day, the modeler said, oh, I think that's more how it used to be done. We don't really do it like that anymore. So I think that might be where some of the fear is coming in, is in these extremely extensive systems. They're worried about how they will be affected by this. But actually, so long as you retain most of the carbon, it doesn't actually negatively affect you that much. Okay, so what are the implications? So the implications, if you store less carbon than natural vegetation, your emissions will be higher if they compare it with natural vegetation. But it will be much easier to mitigate simply by using your land more efficiently. You don't actually have to do the storage as well, so long as you don't occupy the land, someone else can come in and use it for storage. And it's also not very difficult to calculate, because you just use emission factors per hectare, and you know it's reasonably quick and easy to do. So the measures that you want are emissions intensity and yield. So yield is in kilograms of live weight gain per hectare. It becomes a very important measure. It's like your land use efficiency, the same as cropping measures their land use efficiency. When they state their performance, they always say, oh, we get a yield of whatever. So livestock doesn't tend to report their production that way in terms of their land use. And I think that would be a very helpful start, is just reporting how many kilograms per hectare do you get. Hi, Ian. You're muted.
You're muted, Ian.
Thank you. I agree that, you know, you've got to have some measure, and yield is as good as probably most. But that depends on the market value of what's coming out. At the end of the day, farmers are probably going to be more driven by the profit margin.
Exactly.
And so if you actually have a very high value, low yield crop, that's going to what they're going to go towards, rather than, which may have, you know, perverse implications in terms of what you're talking about. So I think in some way the value also needs to be incorporated into that.
So you've actually anticipated my next slide, which is the price of carbon. If we understand that farmers have got businesses to run, their job is to produce our food, right? So you know, now we've gone like, hey, we've got this global problem. We need you guys to come and solve it. Go, hang on a minute, I've got this. I'm trying to produce food here. And it's really bloody difficult job being a farmer. It's extremely difficult to be profitable. I think that it's only about 1 year in 5 that most farms are profitable, and they get bumper years, and then they've got to try and make up for their losses and all the other years. I really take my hat off to the risk that farmers are prepared to take to be in this business. And I think that what we need is a really, really clear signal from not just carbon, other things like the ecological services payments, biodiversity payments, and so on, that farmers can get. If we want them to produce these other things, that's a separate enterprise. And it needs to be cost effective to run the separate enterprise on your business. Not just cost effective, it needs to be attractive. And I think when those incentives are right, like if we were getting the price here for carbon that they get in Europe, how would that look? You know, they got 100 euros per ton like a few years ago. I think was it down to 70 or something now? It's still so much more than what we're getting. Like, I think that's what needs to change. And if we're making it a free market, there's a risk there. And I don't know what we do about that, because the only reason we're doing any of this is because we operate in a free market system. If we worked in a planned economy, we could just say, hey, do this. But we're trying to solve a problem at a global scale with people making decisions at a paddock scale. That's really difficult. Yeah. Yes. So, actually, let's go back. Okay, so yeah, I might just open it up for discussion now. Maybe Ganesh, can you paste these questions into the chat, because I'll stop screen sharing. But yeah, and anything else. This was just some thoughts on what you might want to talk about, but any issues that you have. Oh, you probably can't grab those questions. You're probably having to retype them. Sorry about that. You think of that. Whoops. Okay. Hi, Irina.
Yeah, your questions. Well, I think this is an absolutely essential way of doing it. So the question is how to do it better. I think it's not whether we should do it.
Yes.
And
I think it is coming.
Yeah, it's coming, and it's out of necessity and despair, almost, and a sense of urgency, but also a sense of urgency of helping farmers to navigate the transition. Fair enough. We have dairy farmers cropping peatlands still in Finland. Yes. So how to get them out of this situation that even hardly pays for their livelihood, because prices for milk are so low.
And East Anglia, they think they're going to run out of soil within the next 35 years.
Yeah, but my question is maybe even more challenging in the way. I think it's also impossible to solve it on the scale of farm systems. It should be the scale of food systems. I don't buy into this idea anymore of we need to produce more and more and more and more efficient. We need also to get the food system more efficient so that we don't have to produce more and more. I'm sorry, because there's so many trade-offs here. Yeah. So the more intensive, the better? No, because there are other externalities immediately coming up, to my experience across Europe. So it's also how much of this we're eating of animal derived products. Yes. And again, I have colleagues who are working with these issues with cellular agriculture. And if we go all the way to the extreme of efficiency, then yes, cellular animal products is the only way. Get out of the car.
Yes.
No muscles.
Actually, Ganesh made a good point yesterday. If you put some macadamias in with your mince, your mince patties, you might get some carbon positive to offset your carbon negative. And I guess that's the sort of thing that people like permaculturalists, it's not a very scientific approach, but have been saying is like, can we get more of our food supply from horticulture? And the only issue is that their yields tend to be extremely low because it's hobby farming. Yeah.
I really appreciate that point of Irina's around food consumption efficiency and how much waste there is in the systems. And, if we focused on actually using what we produce, we wouldn't potentially need to, produce at the levels that we do. And therefore we could have more land put aside for other ecological impacts like carbon storage and biodiversity and so on. Yeah, I really appreciate that element in this discussion.
And Tasmania is actually doing really quite well at the moment because it's up there at the top of anywhere in the world, as good as anywhere in the world in terms of having land set aside for, for nature, but it wasn't originally for carbon. Hi, Ian. Yes.
Sorry, having games outside and it's pretty noisy. I suppose I mentioned in the chat about the unwritten costs of food production, and I don't think it's accounted for in any modelling that comes about at the moment. And really, if you've got an equilibrium where your farming has very little effect, so whether you're carbon neutral or you're paying all your staff, it's such a big complex issue. It's not a simple one. And when we talk about the unwritten costs of food production, farming systems have been really good at being really efficient, but the landscape or the animals or the farm workers are the ones that have paid the dividend to allow that cheap food to be produced. And we've got no way of accounting for that. If we can do that, then we're actually in a much better position to have a really healthy, sustainable farming system.
Have you talked to Dom about this sort of thing? Because
no,
Dom's
but
actually
I'd like
doing,
to.
yeah, it might be a good conversation for you guys to have with what you're doing in your PhD, coming up in your PhD.
Because whether you account for it in terms of land degradation rather than land change, that's only one aspect of it. But if you can, if you can pull this off, food's a lot more expensive. So society has to buy into it. So it's exactly what Irene was saying, that we're dealing with a food system, not just production.
Yeah.
And, John Howard's policies of the 80s have done a really great job at guiding where Australia's gone. We're export focused. 70% of our production goes overseas. But then our local market is still dependent on market forces and the costs of it. We still expect cheap food, and we have no food security policy in Australia. We do in Tasmania. We always have 3 days worth of food on the island in case the Bass Strait Ferry fails. But we don't in terms of Australia. We've never really experienced food shortage. And
had the great banana crisis after cyclones in Queensland.
but we can still survive. We don't need bananas. And that's the thing. What do we really need? In Tassie, we can usually survive on sheep and spuds quite well. Not that I eat too much of either, but it's just, I think this is a really interesting topic, and I love the debate that's around it, and land use change and where we go and what farmers can provide. But it really is a food systems approach that's needed, because at the end of the day, we don't want farmers to have to wear this cost and the risk of it. Certainly, I sit on the National Farmers Federation Sustainable Development and Climate Change Committee, and also the paired TGFA or Tas Farmers Committee. And the greatest concern is that farmers will wear the risk and the cost of all of this. And as you say, if it's simply more efficient for carbon storage, carbon sequestration, to turn the landscape back to a natural form, then our food's not going to get produced.
God, if carbon got too expensive, that could happen, couldn't it? If the price went too high.
It is already, corporates are getting into buying up rural land to simply offset their production.
Yeah, so Europe's saying no to
industrial side. So this is scope 3. This is scope 3 rather than necessarily 1 and 2. And I think that's a really interesting point as well. The fact we have to be very, very careful that this is worn across the whole supply chain rather than simply production. Thank you for inviting me. This is awesome.
I think it's really good. And if people want to, I was going to bring up the last slide as well before we finish, but hi, Irina, yes.
No, maybe if there is no time, but I really appreciated the last speaker. Also, we talk a lot in Europe about just transition. And if we're stuck at farm scale, we're shifting the responsibility on farmers, as you say. And if we look at food system, we also as consumers take some of the burden of transitioning. So it's so important to talk about, not just...
Yes, and I guess some people are voluntarily making those choices, but the thing is,
it's not enough.
It's not nearly enough. It needs to be regulated for everybody to do it. But quite how you achieve that without having revolution or something, I don't. That's the problem. Is when you live in an economy, is we have to try and do everything through money.
curiosity, like since I'm really impressed by what Ian is doing, and I was wondering, like, since we are talking about like introducing or bringing in certain percent of vegetation into the current pasture, and what if we bring crops like macadamia or olive instead of with this native vegetation? What do you think, like, in that aspect? Because there are already, I think Tasmania have quite good native vegetation already conserved, but when we are introducing new vegetation or new plantation, what if we bring those crops that can also aid into food security and also extra income for farmers instead of just carbon income?
Mm. Yeah, the trouble is the decision is all in the individual farmer. So, it's all down to what's more profitable. And I mean, we've got this historic problem that livestock tends to be more profitable than horticulture. Yeah, so yeah, and I guess maybe in Europe, so this is a good thing where Irina probably has a very good perspective on this, is that it doesn't just come down to dollars in Europe, because the EU really tries to create policies, but whether they always get it right, it's like, I heard they tried to ban olive oil in reusable bottles. So that's the sort of, and then there was mass protests, so they backed down. But it does a lot of things. Like at the moment, they're still mandating biofuels, even like 15 years after we've known that it's worse than not doing it. Like the energy return on investment is less than one doing that. Hi, Ian.
I think you've actually just thrown me. I should have written it down. It was Ganesh's point about trying to move, maybe moving away from simple farming systems. I think that's one of the greatest issues. I think we need to start building systems thinking into farming. And so we can get effective nutrient cycling, we can get effective ecological functions back in, but we can also increase yields or outputs. So by building in, so with vineyards in Tassie, it's now becoming a little bit more interesting to have cover crops between the rows of vines.
Yep.
And so building in that systems thinking rather than a very simple interventionist approach.
And integrated pest
management can be done.
Sort of start of that.
Absolutely. So building in these ecological systems and ecological processes into everyday farming rather than it's coming. We've seen some really progressive farmers.
Cover cropping is I think Australia is one of the highest adoption places for cover cropping.
Okay.
It's done quite a huge difference from the 50s if you look at what used to go on in the 50s. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. But I mean, the thing is, all of this makes it harder to run a farm, doesn't it? And harder to stay profitable. So
I think it opens up the door for collaborative farming enterprises, where you've got different operators, managing the different parts of the integrated system, potentially as a solution. We put all the emphasis on, the one manager with the one system. If efficiency could be gained through having multiple systems with multiple managers and operators,
Does anyone do that?
We don't like to share.
Yeah, like I found out in Tasmania, if you had shared potato sheds, it would make potatoes a lot more profitable, but you can't get tax relief unless it's on it's individually owned.
It's hard to do
Do you
at scale.
Do you know if anybody does that? Are there any countries that do that sort of thing? See, the only examples I can think of is community gardens in Switzerland. They have farmers come in and do all the planting, and in the US, they have combine harvesters that start in Mexico and go all the way through to Canada, and they just harvest everything and then line as the season changes across the continent. So it's a start. I mean, at very opposite ends of the spectrum. Hi, Irina.
Well, I have two comments to make. First of all, is, I mean, in the European Union, of course, you're right, we have lots of problems, and I've been involved in this policy for like 30 years nearly, but that's because we're a collective of people. We can never get things exactly right, and that's what it is. But we have very good also policies, like Ian was mentioning cover crop and how to make farmers do. We have agri-environment payments where the public pays farmers for like contracts of 5 to 10 years to like try out cover crops. And then if they like it, if it works, they continue, and then they get some money for it from the state,
yes,
if it works well. And there are many others of this kind.
And the other place I've seen that happening really well is Costa Rica. So
exactly.
they
Same
have
as
had
the system
payments
services.
on a small tax on petrol, on fuels, and that pays farmers for environmental services on farms. And it's been going since the late 80s, and they've gone from less than 20% forest in the country to over 50%, and now all farmers tend to think of themselves as ecological farmers. It's been highly successful.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it's not only about money, because it's about education a lot, which comes alongside with this.
Yes.
And then the second about collectives, there are several countries I know, like in Europe, that do a lot of collective work. Like in France, when I visited a couple of years ago, there are no anymore individual farms. They're all collectives, because that's the only way to survive. So 5 farmers make the one enterprise. So they plan across their 5 farms, all the rotations,
Yes.
etc., etc.
France is an interesting example. They're thinking of banning cars from Paris, I hear.
Well, and in the Netherlands, it's also quite common.
Yeah. Rob?
Hi, everyone. I feel I'm probably a little bit of an imposter here, because my focus is really on soils. I'm a soil scientist. And I guess just to let the group know that under the National Soil Strategy, we've put forward a priority project to look at high soil carbon landscapes in Tasmania. And we've done that because the magnitude of soil carbon in organic soils or wetter soils, wetland soils, is huge compared to agricultural soils. So peats or highly organic wetter soils are great sequestration areas, and are at the moment quite a large sink, especially if you account for the World Heritage Area in Tasmania. However, with warming climate, those have the capacity to begin to oxidise and emit. And because of that order, the magnitude of difference between organic soils and farmland, that difference is going to have a huge effect on our emissions. So
do you think there's still potential to store more carbon in soils like that, like Ian was saying?
Absolutely, they're one of the fastest responding soil types on the planet, because you just add water. As soon as you create an anoxic or a lower oxygen environment, you start that accumulation of carbon and organic matter.
When you go through East Anglia, if you walk along the rivers, all the surrounding farm landscape is like 2 or 3 meters lower than the rivers. They're higher because over the centuries they've just sunk as the soils have oxidized.
Yeah. So I guess knowing the reason for joining the group, I'm sorry for I've already extended this sort of comment period for quite some time, so apologies there. I just wanted to let you know that if that project, we're yet to hear whether that's successful. We're hoping to hear in the next few weeks. We'll keep you posted. But I'm very interested in trying to promote on-farm, looking at areas that are traditionally awkward to manage because they're low-lying or have drainage issues, to rehydrating and putting those aside for a number of reasons. There's biodiversity gains, there's carbon sequestration gains, there's drought proofing gains, so you can crash graze those areas in times of drought. There are a whole lot of good reasons for doing this, but in order to get the land manager over the line to do it often requires a bit of a carrot, unless they're, the same way as Ian is wired by the sounds. He wants to do these things, but there's others that need a little bit more of a prod and be led. So we need some good arguments or good demonstration that this can tie in with other calculations that will help them with their carbon accounting. And I'm not a carbon accounting person, so I don't have a lot of experience in that area, but I'd like to know how we could try and work this into the carbon accounting system.
Yes, no, it's really good to hear from you, and particularly from soil science. When we tried to do this accounting from soil, using soil science data, when I was at Cambridge, we couldn't use any of it because soil scientists don't tend to ever report the yields in their production systems. And you need that data to be able to account for it properly. So soil scientists just put a plug in for, please always record your yields when you're looking at production systems, even though it's not part of the soil. So Anna, yes.
Yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, from Landcare's point of view, we do like to run workshops, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on how widely this kind of knowledge is among the general farming community in Tassie. Not much.
No. I think people will worry about it once they have to change, and they won't think about it till then, probably. Although we do get a lot of the carbon accounting workshops that we have, we get a lot of complaints about, this isn't right, this isn't fair, we've done all this work prior and now the baseline says none of that counts, and so we look like the bad guy because we've done the right thing. So this is the problem with the sorts of incentives in the system as it is at the moment. All of that will go away if you include the land use in it.
So I'm just wondering, in the grant application, perhaps it might be nice to put in some money for like some resources that are clear for the wider community around farm efficiency and all your options and different things you can do. And it doesn't even have to be for carbon accounting. It's for biodiversity and everything else. And the other point, from Landcare Tasmania's point of view, we're getting a lot of people coming to us, businesses, corporates, wanting to invest in something. So at the moment, Landcare Tasmania is trying to unravel this big messy ball of wool. That's what it feels like, and so that we can direct this money down to support farmers with projects. So that happens mainly through our project bank. When you're a Landcare member, you can put a project in our project bank, but then we can try and connect some support from all these people that are wanting to do social corporate responsibility, and connect down to the farmers. So hopefully we'll be able to set that up and follow some of the guidelines to increase efficiency.
I mean, one of the good things about all of this is that the values are all aligned. So if you include land use, then what's good for production, it's good for biodiversity, and it's good for carbon. It all works in the same way. Whereas at the moment, they can look like they're at odds with each other, which is really alarming to me, because it makes people want to do the wrong thing. And, I just think it's really important to get these metrics right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I hope we can talk further. And and we're running over time, and we might have to stop soon. But I am happy to hear from people, but people have to go understand. Ian.
Often the way we talk about carbon and it's coming with biodiversity is we're talking about fluxes. We want to see improvement, or we want to see positive change. But that's not regarding what, Anna was just saying, or maybe it was yourself, that people, the early adopters that have already done a lot of really good work because they're only paid from a point forwards or regarded from a certain point forwards. So all that previous stuff is disregarded. it is a bit of a sticking point with farmers in Tassie, because a lot of them have got conservation covenants on their properties. They have changed their practices in the past.
It's not fair,
which isn't recognised. So if there's some way that we can start thinking about this and talking about stores rather than flux.
I agree. And I think that's what this does. So because everyone's against the same baseline, which could be, 1750 vegetation levels or something like that, you don't have this, you're disadvantaged by having already acted. But it's the economists that wanted it to be this way, because they say, why should we pay for something that we can get for free? Well, the reason is because otherwise people will try and work the system and that won't be good for the environment. Okay, Anna, did you still want to say something, or is your hand still up? Okay. Oh, Rob, back to you.
Just really quickly then.
We will have to close after this.
I'm involved with a CSI road-driven project looking at long-term monitoring sites for carbon at the moment. So, and those do have yield associated with the carbon results too.
Okay, great.
We can make those.
Oh, so maybe we can have a look at using that data to do some accounts. Excellent. That would be really good. Okay. So what was that project?
It's a national project for its soil organic carbon monitoring.
Oh, yes, so it's on organic soils. Yeah, they're particularly challenging.
No, sorry. It's not just the organic soils, it's a whole range of land use and soil combinations in Tasmania. There's 30 sites just being monitored.
Wow. Good one.
With 10-year histories.
Okay, so I might just share my screen again and just remind you that if you want to, we can mail out the link to the recording, and if you want to talk about anything else to do with this, or we can send you out the copy of the proposal when we write it, or if anybody else is interested in being part of this conversation, you want to have any more of these meetings to continue to discuss this, Ganesh and I can meet afterwards and go through your comments and think about whether there's additional things that we would talk about differently next time. But yeah, from the point of view of this, thank you very much for joining us and for your interest and participation in this. And I think we better go. I had another meeting that started at 1 as well, so I've got to go too. So sorry. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rowan.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Okay, so Ganesh.
Sorry, Rowan. Thank you very much.
No, really nice to meet you. Thank you so much for this.
Autocorrect got it wrong, got the spelling wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, my apologies.
Yes, hope to talk to you again. Thank you very much. Bye. Oh, has Ganesh left? Oh no, how do I save? Hello, Irina. You still there? Right.